Our next guest will be super well known to all of you. We're about to hear from Paul Scully and learn more about the ALP's vision for Sydney. Paul's been the member for Wollongong since 2016, and within only 3 years of his election, he was elevated to Shadow Cabinet, which is a great testament to the esteem that his colleagues hold him in. Paul's the Shadow Minister for Planning and Public Spaces. He's certainly across the topic that we've just heard from our panel on. And in 2022, he added police and counter-terrorism to his portfolios. As third generation in his family to call Wollongong home, he was saying he drove up or came up this morning. I didn't ask if you drove. Paul intimately understands the challenges we face around housing, jobs, and the need to build connected communities. He's already nominated housing as a major priority for the Minns government, and certainly in our interactions with Paul and his colleagues, and in the announcements that you've seen them make to date, it's definitely going to be a really important platform for them in the upcoming election. We know that they've been thinking deeply about housing and planning and their importance in building a fair and equitable New South Wales. And so today, representing the Australian Labor Party, Paul is joining us to share his visions for Sydney. So please join me in welcoming Paul Scully to the microphone.
Thank you, Sue, for that kind introduction. And as I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. In acknowledging the traditional owners, I also add my own support to enshrining an Indigenous voice in our Constitution and commit to working as part of a future New South Wales Labor government on treaty making here in New South Wales. Just to reflect on the panel that's just gone, I appreciate Tom giving a very succinct version of some of Labor's policy in the lead up to the next election. You'll hear a longer version of that in this speech. And I appreciated Rebecca's contribution. I mean, I don't know who said you can't get a creative and thoughtful public servant in New South Wales, but there's certainly one there. I'd also like to congratulate Eamon, and I appreciate he's had to go back to his current job, on his appointment as CEO of the Committee for Sydney, a return to somewhat familiar ground for him in an era of new challenges, and I'm sure he'll have plenty to do with the committee and the city into the future. I'd also like to extend the apologies of New South Wales Labor leader Chris Minns. An election campaign keeps all of us political actors busy, but none are busier than the leader of the opposition. But I'd also like to thank all of you for staying around. I mean, I appreciate that. I thought a few might have left when it wasn't Chris who was doing the presentation of Labor's views today. Look, setting aside the election contest for the moment, which obviously will have a considerable impact on New South Wales and Sydney, we're a month into 2023 and we're facing some challenging conditions. Rising interest rates and increases in the cost of living are impacting heavily on household budgets, and tomorrow all indications are that rates will go up again. As a result, many households, particularly in the lead up to the start of the school year, have been reassessing their spending, which is also impacting on many small businesses who at the same time who are facing their own cost pressures and supply chain uncertainties. Now, Sydney and New South Wales property markets remain a barbecue stopper conversation. Well, when haven't they been, let's face it. But this year it is because of market correction rather than the skyrocketing increase in prices that we've seen over the last couple of years, with latest reports showing that the median Sydney house dwelling price has dropped below $1 million. But at the same time, rents are increasing rapidly, vacancy rates remain relatively low, and international students are returning. So the immediate term, Sydney is likely to continue to rank highly on the lists of the most expensive cities on the planet, not a valued prize at all. But the ranking that's most frustrated New South Wales Labor over the last few years is the fact that we continue to slip in the rankings of livable cities around the globe. We now consistently find ourselves outside the top 10. And some would reflect worse still, we regularly find ourselves ranking below Melbourne. Now, of course, our challenges don't start and end with a ranking on a respected global indexes. Tomorrow we'll get an insight into the state of the New South Wales Government's finances as the long-delayed mid-year budget update is released. This is an important piece of election and policy development puzzle. It basically tells us what's in the government's bank account, what we can really afford to spend, and how we can invest it. When the last budget was handed down, in June of last year, it forecast debt of $182 billion in New South Wales, with an annual interest bill that was the equivalent of twice what we currently spend on TAFE and about the same as what we spend each year on the New South Wales Police Force. Now, that level of debt means that we rank second in the nation on the most indebted states, and whether that's measured by total or a per capita basis. New South Wales has the slowest growing economy in this country, and we are the highest taxing state in the nation. But don't take my word for it. AAP fact-checked this a few days ago and revealed that the claim parroted by the Premier that New South Wales is the fastest growing economy in Australia is false. We are in fact the slowest. Our AAA credit rating has been shredded. Our interest payments are growing at 24% a year, and even more rankings where we sit at the wrong end of the list. Current macroeconomic conditions and the state of the state's finances are important elements of the challenges facing us. They influence the extent and speed to which we can pursue various policy agendas, but they're not the only thing. Now, I suspect the Premier this morning may have tried to present a much rosier picture of the reality an incoming government faces. Now, New South Wales Labor stands ready for government. We stand ready to use the levers of government to make meaningful changes for hard-working people across the state and throughout Sydney. A little over 50 years ago, when the Whitlam government was elected, one of the pressures identified in the lead-up to that election was the pressures of city growth. In particular, the pressures of growth on Western Sydney and the basic services like water and sewer, schools and services for growing populations. Former Premier Neville Wran said of those years, "It was Caesar Augustus that found Rome brick and left it marble. It will be said of Gough Whitlam that he found the outer suburbs of Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane unsewered and left them fully flushed." Now, those challenges remain, added with the need to deliver public transport to rapidly growing communities in Western Sydney and our collective need to take action on climate change and reduce emissions and use energy more efficiently. All the while, Sydney's population will continue to grow through migration and natural population growth, and our population ages. The federal government's recent population statement forecasts that Sydney's population will grow to 6.1 million people in the early 2030s. Now, that's nearly a decade before the New South Wales government's planning assumptions have it there. So in anyone's language, that's a massive difference and a fundamental assumption that must be resolved to deliver investments in the right place at the right time to improve livability of not only Sydney, but the entire six cities mega region. The size, pace of growth and geographic spread of our population are fundamental to getting the decisions right on the provision of infrastructure and services. An incoming New South Wales Labor government would not only reassess the assumptions on which key elements of the planning of government services rely, but will also seek to rebalance the population growth across Sydney. It's a big commitment and a very big challenge. The pandemic and associated restrictions on people movement over the last couple of years caused people to reevaluate where they live, work and recreate. Many compared notes with friends, families and communities living overseas. In many respects, we did comparatively well compared to other nations with our health statistics. And while some compared their situation to those overseas, many in Western Sydney compared their situation to their neighbours in Sydney's east. The difference across the city was often as stark as differences across the globe. Now, that simply wasn't related to income, but a function of public space, of access to services and access to medical support. It was also a function of public policy decisions of the last decade under the current government. And Sydney Morning Herald has explored some of these stories in its recent Hidden Sydney series. Now, while New South Wales Labor offered considerable bipartisan support for the pandemic health responses, that support stops when the failures are clear and the alternate response is needed. When it comes to planning for population growth in Western Sydney, the bipartisanship ends. When you speak to residents of Western Sydney, whether they are people renting or buying their first home or business people, their criticism is often the same. The system is not working for them. The system is not delivering for commuters who are paying exorbitant tolls or healthcare workers who are working in understaffed emergency departments. The long commute is costing them precious time with family and opportunities to volunteer in community and sporting groups, not to mention productivity losses. It is also not working for businesses who are looking to invest when delays in decision-making mean they find it easier to take their capital interstate, costing us jobs and opportunities. People are rightly pointing out that it just doesn't seem fair anymore. It doesn't seem fair or make sense to people that there are areas of public transport connections rated at the bottom half of Sydney suburbs that are being expected to take the lion's share of future population growth. Across New South Wales, only 41 local government areas will be responsible for a massive 94% of housing growth over the next decade. Now, this screams the need to adjust our planning so that we do not end up with further entrenched traffic snarls, congestions and unhappy commuters. We can no longer allow the approach of growing communities must live with infrastructure deficits until they are addressed at some unknown time in the future. We cannot accept that those growing communities which we have now less access to health and education services should be locked into poorer lifetime outcomes, especially for the children living there. Locking in this disadvantage will not help us address climate change, likely only exacerbate it. We cannot and should not, and let me be clear, under a New South Wales government we will not, exclude areas from Sydney from our collective desire to improve our city and its livability. But too often that's happening. Consider, for example, where public transport investments are being made. In the next 10 years, the vast majority we'll be spending, around $65 billion, will be on the metro. Now, it's an important addition to our public transport network, and I'm not going to criticise the New South Wales government for it. It's a huge price tag, though. The metro must support sensible increase in new housing for families who want to live close to jobs and transport links. And I'm worried we're again failing to align population growth and public transport investment. Blacktown, with an additional 110,500 people, gets 2 metro stations. Travel east on the same line to Cherrybrook Metro Station in Hornsby, and planned population growth is less than 12,000, a tenth of Blacktown's. Travel further east, get to North Sydney, which gets 2 metro stations, yet only 8,740 additional people are planned for those areas over the next 2 decades. Plans for new homes in Crow's Nest Metro Station were dramatically reduced by the current government, with 24 floors of additional housing earmarked for the site suddenly stopped dead by the government due to opposition from local residents. When we get the opportunity to deliver more affordable and key worker housing near metro stations, we should be taking it. We can't pretend we don't need more nurses, paramedics, police officers or teachers, cleaners or hospitality workers closer to Sydney CBD. We do. And the metro provides an opportunity to do that. And that's why Labor will task the Greater Cities Commission to rebalance population and housing growth as it sets its new housing targets on metro lines in the city. This is about fairness and equity. A New South Wales government will deliver on both objectives. Population growth needs to be better balanced, planned and better matched to existing and future infrastructure, especially in public transport. But our Fresh Start for Sydney doesn't begin and end with targets. If elected in March, a New South Wales Labor government will introduce a target of 30% affordable, social and universal housing on surplus public land. The government has only endorsed a similar target, it's not adopted it. And endorsing it only kicks the issue down the road. It's because it's not a real target. We'll target transport land holdings which are close to the public transport hubs. And we know some of the great cities of the world have higher affordable housing targets. London, for example, aims to have 50%. But in New South Wales, we've historically celebrated targets of between 5 and 10%. The bottom line is we have to do better. So rather than turning public land around for stations into hotels, we'll increase the supply of affordable housing for renters in locations well serviced by public transport. A New South Wales Labor government will reduce the confusion, chaos and complexity of the planning system by bringing the more than a dozen different planning agencies that currently answer to 5 different ministers under the responsibility of the Minister for Planning. That minister, and I hope it will be me, will be tasked with getting projects going and will need to work with communities, stakeholders and proponents to improve the way we debate, discuss, engage, negotiate and communicate about projects. Too often I've heard that stakeholders have never met, let alone spoken to each other directly about the concerns they have around specific projects. That's got to change. It's a culture that has to change. Our challenges are far too great for it to continue. The idea that stakeholders can take potshots at each other through the media should end. My approach as Planning Minister will be very simple. I'll talk to and meet with stakeholders and I will listen, and I'll do so openly and transparently. I'll do so ethically. At a time when the means to communicate with one another have never been so easy and the means to do so numerous, there is simply no longer an excuse for stakeholders not to communicate directly and appropriately. Our stamp duty reforms will mean more people will get a shot at owning new homes, with more than 95% of first-home buyers paying either no or a reduced amount of stamp duty, helping to stimulate housing growth, but also stimulate home ownership growth, which has been declining. We'll look at new models to deliver affordable housing, including a trial of build-to-rent model to be undertaken by Landcom on the South Coast, working with the Albanese government to not only play our part to secure a decent chunk of what is possible through the National Housing Accord. We'll reform planning rules around floodplains, starting with Western Sydney, so people aren't put at risk through rising and regular floods. We'll introduce Homes New South Wales to bring together currently fragmented tenant and asset management responsibilities of government when it comes to social housing, to drive down the waiting list of more than 57,000 households, not people, households, who need social housing. But livable cities are more than houses alone. The fresh start we're proposing for New South Wales also includes addressing the pressures on our health and hospital system and to make sure that those who need care can get it when they need it. This involves investments in hospitals throughout Sydney and beyond. It would shock a lot of people, it certainly shocks me, to know that we have actually gone backwards by 365 hospital beds in New South Wales since 2016. Compared to Victoria, which has gained 598 beds, Queensland more than 1,000 beds, and we'll turn that around. We'll deliver an extra 600 beds in areas that need it most. We'll rebuild our healthcare workforce through introducing safe staffing levels in our hospitals, and starting with our emergency departments, and hiring more paramedics for regional New South Wales. In simple terms, New South Wales Labor and government will deliver more beds, more healthcare workers, more paramedics and more services. Our schools will be given the fresh start they deserve with recruitment and retention of our teachers, converting 10,000 casual teachers to permanent positions and cutting teacher admin by 5 hours a week so teachers can actually teach. We'll co-locate preschools in new schools, extending preschool plans to non-government schools. We'll establish a $400 million education investment fund, with that fund used to make investments in teachers, schools, counsellors and establish permanently literacy and numeracy training. We'll ban mobile phones and help reverse the decline in education outcomes and help to tackle cyberbullying. To address climate change and reduce carbon emissions and create jobs, we'll introduce a Net Zero Commission tasked with establishing adaptation and mitigation plans for a range of sectors, including the built environment. We'll invest in skills and manufacturing and set local content requirements as we invest to replace transport assets, which will turbocharge investment pipelines for manufacturing businesses in Sydney and across the region. We'll protect public assets like Sydney Water, Landcom, Forestry Corporation and others by moving a new law to stop privatisation in the future. And we'll open Prospect Reservoir for recreational activities to give families in Western Sydney a place to swim, providing additional access to open, safe and affordable recreation. It's time to also get Sydney's nightlife going again. Lockouts and lockdowns have put a dampener on Sydney at night, and when you talk to firms looking to invest in Australia or expand their operation, they want to do so in a city where their staff can actually enjoy living. Through the hard work of our Shadow Minister for Music and the Nighttime Economy, John Graham, Labor drove a series of reforms to the nighttime economy in 2020, but the government's own report tabled in November last year said the reforms have barely been used. New South Wales Labor has a plan to support a vibrant, safe city for people who want to go out and for nighttime workers. This is something that touches on all aspects of government: planning, licensing, culture and tourism, as well as transport. It's New South Wales Labor's view that governments need a plan for the nighttime economy just as much as it does for the daytime economy. Now, the future arc of economic activity and opportunity in the 6 cities mega region will run, and I say this somewhat parochially, if you'll excuse me here, it will run from Wollongong and the Illawarra in the south, through southwest Sydney and into Western Sydney and into the Hunter. Now, Sydney CBD will of course remain an important and dynamic driver of our economy and our community, but there will be an addition of this new multi-city economic arc. That requires connection and integration of those areas. It means they must be connected to the big opportunity that is being built in Western Sydney right now, the Nancy Bird Walton Airport. Like the Metro, we only have one opportunity to get that right. And if reports I hear from areas near to the airport are correct, I fear that we might be getting wide of the mark now, and with key connections to nearby communities not being prioritised, or worse, their need being ignored. Talk of rapid buses connecting Western Sydney to Western Sydney Airport have fallen by the wayside, abandoned by the current government. This risks isolating the airport. We cannot afford to have an airport in Western Sydney that is disconnected from parts of Western Sydney. Failing to get this right will mean more companies look further afield to opportunities to invest their capital. On March 25th, New South Wales Labor is offering Sydney a fresh start. We want to work in partnership with all levels of government and the private sector to create a better Sydney and a better New South Wales. We believe in an inclusive and fairer Sydney, one that provides equal opportunity, not based on not opportunity dictated by postcode, no matter whether you work for a business or you own one that maximises the benefits of infrastructure and social investment, recognises the task of providing housing for a growing and changing population, is not divorced from the need for people to work near where they live, to have places to recreate, enjoy and connected with high quality public transport and collectively help us achieve our shared goals. Importantly, one that lifts Sydney back into the top ranks of the world's best cities, because that's where we belong. Great cities don't just happen. They require skill, diligence and discipline. We cannot sleepwalk into a sprawling disaster for Sydney where we add one street to the Western Sydney fringe each and every other week. We can build a beautiful city with balanced growth, develop momentum around well-built and designed neighbourhoods that give young buyers and renters the opportunity to own or live in a piece of the most beautiful city on earth. The next election is about what is possible for Sydney and for New South Wales, not just for the next year, but over the coming decade and decades ahead. Our job is to not just claim Sydney as the most beautiful city this side of the equator, but the most beautiful city in the world. And it's our ambition to deliver it. New South Wales Labor believes that the fresh start we're offering in the lead up to March 25 will help achieve exactly that. Thank you for your time.
So look, if the public polling is to be believed, in about 6 weeks, you'll be the minister and every single problem that's been raised here today will be yours to solve.
Looking forward to it.
And if you can do it in a few months, that would be great too.
No pressure.
I was going to ask you, and you actually just went there, you're from Wollongong, about the six city concept. Are you really a believer in that, or are you a bit of a skeptic? Do you think it's a forced fit?
There may be elements that are, but the concept that Wollongong's future and the Illawarra's future, and for that matter the Hunter and the Central Coast future, aren't connected to the economic powerhouse and jobs powerhouse that is southwestern and Western Sydney would be naive. I said it in my first speech, in fact, so it's something I've worked on for a long time. When I was at the University of Wollongong, I helped them set up a Liverpool campus, reflecting on the fact that there was a host of students that were interested in an education out of the University of Wollongong, but wanted the opportunity closer there. So the opportunity's there, but the connections have got to be made. And as a former editor of the Illawarra Mercury, I would have thought you'd be journalist. Sorry, you promoted you. You would have been on board with that at the time, I think.
So on that point, you know, it takes an hour and a half or so to drive to Sydney. What can you tell us? What will Labor do to cut that to 45 minutes?
Well, we're frustrated by the fact that in 2019, the government paid Professor Andrew McNaughton probably a considerable sum to examine faster rail options throughout New South Wales, connections with the Hunter, connections with Canberra, connections with the Illawarra and South Coast. And despite that having been finished 4 years ago, it remains secret. So that's part of our frustration. But also, you'll have to excuse me for this sort of comment, but we've got 47 days to go, so you'll have to watch this space in some of that stuff.
Watch this space.
But the connection is not for the Illawarra, for the Hunter, for the Central Coast. It's not just straight into Sydney CBD like it used to be. Many people are living in those parts of the world and commuting into Western Sydney, whether it be into Parramatta or into other places. So it's making sure that all of the connections are made as they're needed, because we don't want to lose a connection to the future of Western Sydney Airport either.
Density. You talked a bit there in your speech about the need for higher density around metro stations. That's something that I know Chris Minns is obviously very keen on pursuing. Other than that, how else are you going to achieve this rebalancing that you talk about between the west and, I guess, let's face it, the other parts of Sydney, like the North Shore or the east, for instance?
Look, it largely is around what we can do around the metro in the first instance and getting that done. It is too important an opportunity in terms of the way that the city's transport infrastructure will change to not take the opportunity to try and do it. And density, most people think of it in terms of high rise, but in terms of that sort of stuff, it's not going to work absolutely everywhere, but we've got to look to where there's opportunities around those transport hubs to make it work. We can't continue the endless push for whether it's to the fact that it makes it difficult on governments to keep up with the infrastructure challenges that come with an endless push out to greenfield areas, or whether it comes with the fact that there's a climate element that we've got to deal with there as well. So rebalancing the population, rebalancing those targets around the metro areas is something we're taking particularly seriously.
Well, what is your actual, I'm sure there's a long list, but what is your chief criticism of the current government's approach to planning?
Confusion. It seems that whenever there's been a problem over the last few years, there's been another agency set up, or there's been a political imperative internally within the government to set up a split arrangement. So you've got, setting aside local government and utilities and the like, you've got more than a dozen different agencies reporting to 5 different ministers. And I get people coming to me regularly and say, well, I went to these guys because I thought they were the ones who were supposed to take this. They told me it was someone else. I went to them, they told me it was someone else, and then I got sent back to the start. And I still don't know where I'm supposed to put this in. I'm going interstate.
Tom McKellar obviously made that point from Lend-Lease. He also, I think, made a pretty fascinating intervention, effectively calling for a 30% mandated diverse housing component in new builds. Now, you've talked about 30% in certain builds. Why not go the full way and make it every new development?
Look, I think it's important that government starts and leads by example. And that's why we've set that 30% target on ourselves. And I don't say that 30%'s a minimum. We would seek to, where there's opportunities and it's sensible to go higher, we obviously would. And then there's a conversation that we need to start with the entire sector, the private sector, about how we deliver more. And I'd welcome Tom's contribution to that today. But there's no one's cracked that nut. No other jurisdiction has really cracked that nut.
Because everyone else does it. Why not us?
That's right. I don't know. There's something that's stopped it. Whether or not it's not been taken seriously enough, whether the work hasn't been done, but even other, interstate jurisdictions haven't. And part of it, I think, is part of the lead time on projects. I mean, people are holding land for a little while because it takes a while to get through the assessment process and get a project approved and financed and the like. So to do it, say, on the 1st of January in year X that we do it, that changes the dynamic of so many projects, which you don't want to stop. So I think we've got to work through the system and see where we can go with that. And if we can get to a similar sort of thing that Tom's talking about, I'd welcome it.
Is there, and I want to be careful around how I choose my words here, but do you think that there is a public sentiment concern about a concept like that, or do you think it's more the logistics that's stopping this thing?
Probably a bit of both. There's clearly communities who believe they've done their bit in some of these sort of areas, and that they having some developed perhaps foisted upon them without having the other infrastructure that keeps pace, whether it's say Canterbury Hospital, Fairfield Hospital and the like, which is part of the reason we're investing in those. There's probably some resistance within other stakeholder groups, but it's something we've got to work through. I mean, if we don't talk about this, we don't try and work towards a goal, then we're never going to get there, and we're going to spend our time in the lead up to the 2027 election and perhaps beyond having a similar conversation in forums like this, where we haven't achieved what we want to do. And the reality is, I don't think anyone would disagree with the idea of having more teachers and police and the like, and hospitality workers living near to where they work. Why should they have to commute 3 hours to get in and out?
I promise I'm not texting, I'm bringing up Slido.
I was going to say, you're that bored already, mate.
I do just want to ask you one more question, and a disclaimer that the Herald has been a supporter in an editorial sense, through our editorials, I should say, of the government's stamp duty and land tax reforms. You guys are calling that a forever tax. I mean, that's just a lie, isn't it? That's a scare campaign. It's not a forever tax.
It is a forever tax.
But it's not.
It's only not a forever tax if you sell the home that you elect to pay the stamp duty on, because it doesn't end. It doesn't end even, if you were to die while holding that, you pay it out of until that property's sold.
Sure.
It continues to get paid.
People
do move. Plenty of people don't.
But
My parents still live in their first house.
The majority of first homeowners move after around 10 years. So
some do. but plenty don't. And that's
that's
why
their
we
choice,
think
isn't it? That's their choice.
But
They can opt in.
yeah, and that's why we've got a situation where we believe our stamp duty changes, where 96%, or 95%, sorry, of first homeowners or first home buyers will pay little or no stamp duty is a better option, because circumstances can change, and you can't opt out without moving, and that's the fundamental problem with this. It's a regressive in nature.
Do you think you're on the wrong side of history with this one? Every Productivity Commission report, all sorts of reports, the IMF, everyone talks about this issue and says stamp duty is a really inefficient, ridiculous tax. You guys are sticking with it. Why? Well, why?
We believe in terms of the first home buyers market, this gives a better option.
We'll go to some Slido questions, and we'll go with the most popular. Faster, fast, or high-speed rail to the regions? Pick which level of speed you prefer.
Well, it's an election, so aren't we supposed to talk about high speed? Isn't that obliged?
Yeah,
No.
yeah.
Look, let's start with faster. Like, I mean, I spent 10 years commuting from Wollongong to Sydney by train, and it's a tough journey at times. It's a long journey at times. It shouldn't be. It's now a journey that is slower than when the Red Rattlers were in place doing that same commute. Now, part of that's because of a viaduct in Stanwell Park that's very, very old. But let's start with faster, and let's build on from there.
Will your government look to reshape and shuffle the government departments?
Oh, look, any incoming government will have a look at that. If you had Chris here, perhaps he'd be able to give a more detailed answer what he might be thinking, but I can't today, sorry.
But clearly you are of the view that the number of government agencies or departments in terms of planning is too many?
Well, we've already said, when it comes to planning, we'll collapse those responsibilities for those more than a dozen agencies in under the Minister for Planning, rather than having to answer to 5 different ministers who for various reasons, those agencies can't actually speak to the Planning Minister. So we start with those sort of reforms, and I expect that there'll be a similar sort of machinery of government changes in other areas.
Someone's yelling at us for talking about driving to Sydney, but you've just got us out of trouble there by talking about rail, so we'll move on from that one.
Well, we've got no option but to drive to Western Sydney, and that's part of the problem. That's part of the connection issue.
We've done that one. Will Labor support an ongoing model of franchising public transport as adopted by the Coalition? If not, what will happen with existing private involvement?
So we've been pretty clear in our views about privatisation. We are not in support of it. Now that extends in terms of, let's say buses, for instance, and there's been a big debate in Sydney around buses and the franchising of bus networks. We've already said that we'd establish a working group with the bus industry, with other stakeholders involved in it, to try and work through what's been created out of that, and to work through what the future of bus arrangements might be. But you won't see any further arrangements there.
This morning with the Premier, we were talking about cities being more than just the physical the bricks and mortar, but the health and well-being of its residents. An issue on health and well-being is clearly poker machines. The government's put out their policy today. You guys put yours out a few weeks ago. Just hanging off a question here. The truth is, though, that you guys have not actually committed to cashless gaming in New South Wales. So this person is asking, why don't you support broader reform?
We've put out a comprehensive reform package. Our reform package includes not only a trial of the cashless gaming technologies, and there are multiple, to work through that. It includes reducing the cash input limits that are on machines, reducing the number of machines, getting rid of the outdoor advertising, putting $100 million into harm minimisation, third-party exclusion arrangements so families can intervene when there's a problem and get people excluded from venues. Now, I haven't seen the detail and haven't heard the detail of the government's plan today. I've seen some that was reported today, of course, but I haven't seen them mention anything around the exclusion issue, around the harm minimisation, anonymisation issue, around dealing with the fact that there's the outdoor advertising arrangements. I think I caught a snippet when I was coming in to say that they were not going to accept donations. Why has it taken them a couple of weeks to actually get to that point?
Well, why has it taken you guys?
Well,
you only did it 2 weeks ago.
We said it a couple of weeks ago. You know, that was part and parcel of our first thing.
We've had 20 or 30 years of clubs and pubs having poker machines.
The government's had 12 years of government too.
True.
Right.
But the point is that you're not adopting, as the government is, the number one recommendation of the Crime Commission report, which was cashless gaming on all poker machines. That's true, isn't it? You're not adopting that yet.
We have said that we'll undertake a trial with a view to getting the technology right, with a view to understanding the impact on the arrangements. And look, the government sort of said in its own way that they're willing to give some leave passes to a few people if you appeal to the right person.
Yeah.
Now, if that works the same way as other programs have done with this government, it might be half of regional New South Wales who gets it.
You could drive a truck through that. One of the really interesting discussions this morning with the Premier in a Slido question was, why are we still naming things through English ties in Sydney? The Queen Elizabeth II Square being one of them. Where do you stand on that? Should we name the square after the late Queen, or should we do something else? The Paul Scully Square, perhaps?
As long as it's not memorial. To be honest, I haven't given a lot of thought myself personally to naming of the Queen Elizabeth Square. But we've said in terms of we've got to look at the way we do things and reflecting our Indigenous culture and things, and that starts with some of the treaty making exercise. But that will likely flow through to the way we name some things, the way we go about approaches, to that entire exercise to what we do in naming things more broadly. I mean, why aren't we naming things after some of the great Australians who have come through? Why aren't we naming we've said when it comes to sporting stands at major venues, because there's not one, I don't think, in Sydney named after a female athlete, that we'll start to name them after great female athletes, because it's the right thing to do. It should be done. It shouldn't always be those male or the regal naming.
Final question. You talked in your speech about the tricky situation that the budget's in, the pressure that you're under. What projects that the government has embarked on or announced or in current planning phase would you stop? Can you tell us some now?
Well, we've already said that we won't be pursuing the Northern Beaches link. Yep. That's one. A lot of that detail, a lot of that work only can really happen after tomorrow when we see the state of the mid-year books. Now, it's really been quite frustrating that we haven't had that information until in February. Ordinarily, for those who don't watch the excitement that is the New South Wales budget papers, when the budget's handed down in June, the mid-year update comes out in November. Now, the government announced a day before it was sort of due that they were kicking that forward into February. And that was basically so we couldn't see what was there, and it limits us. So, to be honest, it'll be in part what's in the books tomorrow.
Do you want to get into a competition around who can build the most, or do you think there's no value in pursuing that level of construction and development that the government's been on?
Have a look at the record. We are going to the third election in some circumstances where schools have been promised and haven't been started. In my own part of the world, Shell Harbour Hospital has been promised 3 times at 3 elections, and there's still not a shovel that's gone anywhere near that plot of land. So people were rightly cynical after 12 years of the current government that just because they promise projects, they won't necessarily ever deliver them. We're going to be responsible. We're not going to go on a spend-a-thon for the sake of some sort of election auctioneering. What we're going to do, what we say we're going to do, we will diligently pursue, and that's the way we'll approach government.
Paul, thank you very much. Maybe this time next year you will be here as the Minister, so we will see what the next 7 weeks brings. Good on you.
Thanks, Evan. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.